The United States shift from free market champion to market protector. The notion of the United States shifting from a defender of free market principles to a proponent of protectionist measures has gained traction in recent years. Historically, the US has been a significant force in establishing a neoliberal economic order that emphasizes reduced government intervention, open market competition, and global trade liberalization. However, recent policies, notably the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, signal a shift toward greater government intervention in critical sectors, particularly in response to economic competition with rising global powers like China. These moves have raised questions about the US's commitment to free market principles, as the country increasingly relies on state intervention and regulatory protection to bolster domestic industries. A legacy of free market advocacy and neoliberal principles. The United States' influence on global trade policy has roots stretching back to the post-World War II era, when it played a crucial role in developing the Bretton Woods system, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and eventually the World Trade Organization, WTO. Through these institutions, the US encouraged international economic cooperation based on neoliberal principles, which promoted free trade, deregulation, and limited government interference in the economy. This advocacy for free market principles shaped the global economy, with the US setting an example by eliminating trade barriers, liberalizing its economy, and opening its markets to foreign competition. A foundational principle of the WTO is Most Favored Nation, MFN status, which stipulates that countries must treat all WTO members equally, ensuring that no nation receives preferential treatment. Another key principle is national treatment, which requires that foreign goods, once inside a country's market, be treated the same as domestic goods. The US championed these principles for decades, pushing other countries to comply and often pressuring them to eliminate subsidies or barriers deemed anti-competitive. Yet, while advocating for free markets abroad, the US also engaged in strategic intervention in various sectors. Subsidies to the agricultural industry serve as a long-standing example of how the US often promoted liberalization selectively. Despite GATT agreements aimed at curbing such subsidies, the US continued supporting its agricultural sector with billions of dollars in subsidies, which enabled American farmers to dominate international markets. This practice placed small farmers in developing countries at a disadvantage as they struggled to compete with subsidized American products, leading to widespread criticism of US policies as anti-competitive. The rise of China and the US's shift from free market principles, with China's rise as a global economic power, the US has faced intensified competition across several high-value industries, including semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and clean energy technology. China's state-led economic approach, characterized by extensive subsidies and government-backed initiatives, has enabled rapid advancements in sectors critical to the global economy. Faced with this competition, the US has responded not by adhering to traditional free market principles, but by adopting its own set of interventionist policies. This shift away from free market principles can be observed in the increasing reliance on industrial policy, where the government actively promotes specific sectors deemed vital to national security and economic competitiveness. The CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act stand as prominent examples of the US's pivot to industrial policy and selective economic nationalism. Both acts mark a departure from the hands-off approach traditionally associated with free market economics, instead embodying elements of mercantilism aimed at protecting and bolstering US interests in the face of global competition. The CHIPS and Science Act, protecting domestic semiconductor production. The CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 represents one of the most significant examples of US market intervention in recent decades. Prompted by concerns over reliance on foreign semiconductor manufacturing, particularly from Taiwan and China, the Act seeks to boost US production capacity and reduce dependence on foreign sources. The CHIPS Act allocates $52.7 billion in direct subsidies and grants to US-based semiconductor manufacturers, In addition to $200 billion earmarked for scientific research and innovation in key fields such as quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. Several aspects of the CHIPS Act deviate from free market principles and raise questions regarding its compliance with WTO rules. Direct government subsidies. By investing directly in private semiconductor firms, the U.S. government is not only supporting an entire industry, but also altering the global supply chain. This level of intervention distorts market dynamics by providing a significant advantage to U.S.-based firms, effectively shielding them from foreign competition. 2. Exclusive nature of subsidies. The CHIPS Act requires that companies receiving subsidies invest only in US-based production facilities, a stipulation that precludes foreign firms from accessing US government support. This exclusivity contradicts the WTO's non-discrimination principle and establishes a precedent for selective economic favoritism that disadvantages foreign competitors. 3. Export restrictions. In addition to financial subsidies, the CHIPS Act includes export restrictions that prevent US companies from selling certain high-tech products to China, limiting access to critical technology. By imposing such restrictions, the US government is shaping international supply chains in a way that prioritizes national interests over global trade rules. These provisions have spurred debate over whether the CHIPS Act truly aligns with the principles of a free market economy. By selectively supporting its domestic semiconductor industry, the US is, in effect, picking winners and distorting market outcomes, a move that some analysts liken to the kind of economic protectionism the US once criticized in other nations. The Inflation Reduction Act, Renewable Energy and Industrial Policy signed into law in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, is another example of the US abandoning free market principles in favor of an interventionist approach. While the IRA is primarily aimed at addressing climate change, healthcare, and inflation, it also includes significant subsidies and incentives targeted at domestic industries. The Act allocates approximately $369 billion to support renewable energy initiatives and the electric vehicle, EV market in the United States. However, the stipulations for receiving these subsidies favor domestic manufacturing and limit the participation of foreign companies. The Inflation Reduction Act's impact on global trade and competition is evident in several of its provisions. Restrictions on foreign EV manufacturers. The IRA includes substantial tax credits for electric vehicles, but only if these vehicles are assembled in North America and utilize a minimum percentage of minerals sourced domestically or from free trade partner nations. By excluding foreign manufactured EVs from these credits, the IRA effectively disadvantages international automakers, a move that has drawn criticism from the European Union and other US trade partners. 2. Subsidies for US renewable energy producers. The IRA offers tax incentives, grants and rebates primarily to US-based companies that manufacture solar panels, wind turbines and batteries. By focusing these benefits on domestic producers, the IRA undermines the non-discrimination principle enshrined in WTO agreements, raising concerns among foreign competitors who face unfair barriers in the US market. 3. Regulated sourcing of critical minerals. Another provision within the IRA requires that automakers source minerals, such as lithium and cobalt, from approved nations to qualify for tax credits. This stipulation encourages automakers to align with US-approved supply chains, creating a form of economic nationalism that could fragment global supply chains for essential resources and impact global competition. International reaction to the IRA has been mixed, with several allies, including South Korea, Japan, and the European Union, expressing frustration over what they perceive as protectionist measures. The EU has even threatened to file a formal complaint with the WTO, arguing that the IRA's EV tax credits and renewable energy subsidies contravene fair trade rules by excluding European automakers from benefits provided to their American counterparts. The WTO and trade partners' reactions. The international response to the CHIPS Act and IRA has been swift, with U.S. trade partners raising concerns that these policies violate WTO principles. At its core, the WTO was founded on the idea that member nations would maintain open markets, fair competition, and non-discriminatory trade practices. By offering substantial subsidies that are exclusive to U.S. firms, the CHIPS Act and IRA violate these principles, potentially disrupting global supply chains and distorting market outcomes. Countries affected by these acts, particularly in Europe and Asia, have suggested that they may challenge these policies in WTO dispute resolution mechanisms. European nations, in particular, have argued that the IRA's tax credits for domestically produced EVs amount to a form of disguised protectionism, using climate policy as a cover for preferential treatment of American manufacturers. This criticism underscores a broader trend in which countries increasingly use national security or environmental concerns to justify policies that favor domestic industries, effectively undermining the open market ideals promoted by the WTO. Historical context: the US's record of market intervention. The CHIPS Act and IRA are recent manifestations of market intervention, but the US has a long-standing history of implementing protective economic measures when it perceives a strategic need. This selective use of free market principles has sparked controversy in the past, as US actions have often conflicted with its pro-free market rhetoric. Agricultural subsidies. US agricultural policy has long been a point of contention. Through various subsidy programs, the US has shielded its agricultural sector from market fluctuations, allowing American farmers to sell products at artificially low prices. These subsidies not only enable American products to dominate global markets, but also disadvantage small farmers in developing countries, many of whom cannot compete with subsidized American goods. Critics argue that US agricultural subsidies violate WTO principles on fair competition and create an uneven playing field. Airline industry support. The US has historically intervened in its airline industry, most notably following the 9/11 attacks and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Through multi-billion-dollar relief packages, the government has provided direct financial assistance to US-based airlines, effectively insulating them from international competition. Although these bailouts were justified as necessary to protect a critical industry, they illustrate the US's willingness to abandon free market principles when convenient. Steel and aluminum tariffs. The US imposed tariffs on imported steel and aluminum in 2018 under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, citing national security concerns. These tariffs, while beneficial to domestic producers, hurt foreign manufacturers and were seen as a direct violation of WTO rules. The tariffs provoked retaliatory measures from trade partners, sparking trade disputes and raising questions about the US's commitment to free market ideals. The selective nature of the US's commitment to free markets, the CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and other recent economic policies reflect the US's growing preference for selective market intervention in strategic sectors. Although the US has historically promoted free market principles and pressured other nations to adhere to them, it has increasingly resorted to protectionist measures when confronted with global competition. This shift raises questions about the long-term viability of the US as a leader in promoting global trade liberalization, as its recent actions suggest a more self-interested approach. The selective commitment to free market ideals is particularly significant in the context of U.S. China competition. As China continues to rise as a global economic power, the U.S. faces a choice. It can either adhere to the principles of the free market or pursue a more protectionist approach. Given the trend towards interventionist policies, it seems likely that the U.S. will continue to prioritize strategic interests over free market ideals, further straining its relationships with global trade partners. Ultimately, the US's increasing reliance on protectionist measures represents a departure from the ideals it once championed. This shift not only has significant implications for global trade dynamics, but also risks undermining the credibility of the international economic system the US helped create. As the world becomes increasingly multipolar, the US faces the challenge of balancing national interests with the free market principles it has long promoted, as the erosion of these principles could reshape the global economy in unexpected ways.